Welcome, Dr. Christian De Vito. Here we come with our first question. To know how in your career did you start working with global history and what defines it in your conception?
Yes, so first of all, thanks for inviting me here. So I think I can start from the second part of the question. What defines in my conception global history? I think this is the important point. There are three sets of issues that are central to global history as far as I am concerned. The first one is that there is this attempt to go beyond ethnocentrism and especially beyond Eurocentrism. The second one is that there is an attempt to go beyond methodological nationalism, so beyond this history is written from the perspective of the national state as it is now. And the third one, which is the most problematic side of global history, but I will come back on this, is the question of the spatial awareness. So global history invites us to think about this, to be spatially aware, to spatialize the historical and social processes, to understand how they are positioned in space and how space is constructed. So if I look at these 3 points, I must admit that, say, my career is not really a career in the sense that it's very precarious. But anyway, there is a sort of shift when I, until 2009, I was in Italy, and then after 2009, I was in the Netherlands for 9 years, and then now for 2 years in Germany. And until the point I was in Italy, I have to say that I was not very explicitly busy with the questions, say, number 1 and 2. So beyond ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, and beyond national methodological nationalism. But I did have in my research and in my research projects, I did have some kind of spatial awareness, in the sense that I was especially trying to address one point. So how the singularity of each locality can go together with the connectedness of each locality. So for example, I did a research on the mental health services in the second half of the 20th century in Italy. And there what I saw is that even within a region like Tuscany in Italy, there were many different trajectories, many different stories. So why were, for example, the mental health services in the province of Florence so different from those in another province within the same region? And this kind of dialectics between singularity and connectedness, this is something that has been central in other research, like in the period when I was in Italy already. So, for example, the research I did on the prison system in Republican Italy, and also another research I did on the city of Reggio Emilia in the 50s to the 80s, about all the experiences that were there and how they were, again, very specific, very singular, but very connected with many other parts of the world. So this was something that I found back then later on when I started reading, when I moved to the Netherlands and I started reading books and articles on global labor history especially, and then on global history. Because, and this connects, of course, now, this continues now in the present research I'm having on punishment and empire, especially on the Spanish monarchy, where again I find a lot of historical processes, colonization, the construction, empire building, the relationship between the metropole and the provinces or the colonies, etc. And again, I have to grasp this question of singularity and connectedness. But on the same time, of course, by reading things on global history, I had to reflect more on this question of how to go beyond Eurocentrism and methodological nationalism. And I have to say that, I mean, although I had not thought about this so explicitly earlier on, somehow it resonates quite naturally with me, with my thoughts, especially from the political side of my experience, because already in Italy I had somehow been part of social movements, of political organization, where the question of reflecting critically about nationalism or trying to break ethnocentrism, for example, vis-a-vis the question of migration into Italy, etc. These have been central. So in that sense, I was somehow prepared to the message of global history, even somehow before reading things about global history.
Perfect. Here we go to our second question. What are the possibilities for dialogue, in your opinion, between the local and the global, the micro and the macro?
Right, and this is, I think, the key question of all, because as I was saying, while on the point of ethnocentrism and methodological nationalism, I'm going beyond these points, there is a sort of consensus among global historians. The question of spatial awareness opens up the Pandora box of global history, if you want, in the sense that the global labor historians understand this spatial awareness in very different ways. And of course, the standard way to go with this is to think about global history, global history as something like predefining the spatial scope. So trying to see historical processes primarily which are on the global scale, so that are about connectedness across regions of the world, etc. And we can think about many books about this, like from Pomeranz, etc. But my point and my take on this is maybe minoritarian and critical regarding this. My point is that the type of analysis, so micro, macro, and the spatial scope of research, local, global, cannot and should not be conflated. So to say that in another way, it is not that local history is micro and global history is macro. Micro and macro operates on the epistemological level. So it is about two different ways to understand the historical fabric, to understand how history is constructed, how history is made. While the spatial scope of research, that's about spatiality. And there the question is indeed whether we have to think in terms of scale, of spatial scale, so local, global, eventually even a mesoscale, or whether we can find a way to get rid of the concept of scale altogether, like what I propose. And I've been thinking about this for many years now, and I came to this conclusion that of what I call microspatial approach. And it's called like this, and I know it's not very trendy and it's not very sexy maybe as a title, but it captures what I want to say, and therefore it helps me in illustrating this. I talk about micro spatial history, micro, and this is a clear-cut decision. It's micro and it's not macro. And what is the point there? The point is that macro history, the one I reject, is the kind of history that starts from the predefinition of three things: spatial units, temporal units, and categories. So that means that when you do macro history, you are predefining, for example, the key concept, slavery, convict labor, tributary labor, etc. You have standard universal definitions of this. You decide in advance what the temporal units are. So you define in advance what is the period that you are going to look at, and the spatial unit, where is the region that you are, or the place that you are going to look at. Microhistory is not about that. It's not about that, not because it does not engage, not because it's empiricist, not because it derives everything like directly from the sources. Indeed, microhistory is very epistemological, it's very theoretical. but it opens up the possibility to really look at what is in the primary sources, in defining, therefore, the categories, the temporal units and the spatial units, starting from what is in the primary sources, reflecting on that, going back to the primary sources, reflecting on that again, without defining once and for all these kind of categories and units. The example is, if you take a taxonomy like many macro historians do in global history, you would have a taxonomy that it's already like has these classifications, and you are already looking for somehow building data sets relating to certain spatial units and temporal units. Microhistory is not about this, because the vision of history behind that, the vision of the fabric of history, is different. It is a vision that allows for looking not only continuity across space, but also disconnections. Not only continuity across a certain within a certain society, but also disjunctures, for example, on the class level, on the ethnic level, on the gender level, on the age level and generational level. So this is the first part, the micro of the microspatial approach. The other part is, of course, the spatial. And the reason why I don't call this approach micro-global, like in many other scholars do, is that once again, spatial reveals the possibility to look at the spatial unit, to look at the spatial dynamics in an open-ended way, without saying we are primarily concerned with the global scale or with the global level. And this goes so far, in my vision, to reject the concept of scale altogether. If you talk about scale, you are already predefining, once again, that certain historical processes are located, for example, at the local scale, and other historical and social processes are located per definition, by definition, at a global scale. I think this is not the case. Think about the slave trade. Where is that located? Is there a scale where that is located? Or is that a question of an interplay of several different actors with different levels of power located in different localities, in different sites, who are all relevant to the construction of the practices and the processes that altogether form these things that we call Atlantic slave trade. And you can do this exercise for many other things. So what I'm arguing about scale, which is very relevant about the question of local global, is that scale is a social and historical construction, and it should be considered as the object of historical research, connected with power, inequality, disjunctions, instead of an analytical tool. So we do not use scales in order to say, okay, this phenomenon is at that level, this other phenomenon is at this level, but we try to understand why in the discourse and in the practices of the historical actors, they or some of the actors try to locate and legitimize their power by saying that their power was located at a higher level, at a higher scale, for example, of others. So once again, why the King of Spain had the power to say that what he was doing was on a different scale, on a metropolitan scale, while what other actors, historic actors, were doing was located at lower and different scales. I think this is the key point. And this is the key point where my approach, the microspatial approach, is different from many other approaches, not only in global history, but also in the attempts to bring together microhistory and global history. Because these approaches, other approaches, somehow, they do have this idea that bringing together microhistory and global history is about bringing together the local and the global as two separate scales. While in my case, The microspatial perspective conceptualizes historical processes as resulting from multiple social practices across time and across singular yet connected sites. And here, somehow, again, I'm back to my own origin about this question of how social processes are located in singular and connected context. So you have war, you have slavery, you have convict labor, you have the process of accumulation of capital. All these historical processes, they are located in singular sites, but singular sites that are not singular because they are isolated and therefore local in the sense of isolated from each other, but they are actually specific, singular, because they are differently connected with other parts. And just to close this part and to respond to your question, this, of course, asks us to be very much aware not only about connections and connectivity, which is sort of the big theme in global history generally, but also on disconnections, disjunctures, different levels of power, power hierarchies, inequality within societies, within context, and in the broader context that we see. And the last point is that what I understand as context in itself, just like many other Italian, especially microhistorians would do, is not, context is not a sort of synonym for locality, for specific, for local. Context is the relevant context of the social process you are studying. So that if you are studying Atlantic slavery again, the context of what you are studying is as much the localities that are in the African coast and even in the African internal part of Africa, as much as the ship itself by which the slaves were transported, and then the ports where they were shipped to, and all the destination they were sent to. So all the bundle of these sites, this translocal reality, all this is the context in my definition. And you see that therefore I try to go beyond the local global divide here, just like I try to go beyond the agency structure divide for the very same reason. Agency is not the thing that is only at the local level, and structure is not the kind of thing that is just up there somewhere in abstract global level. Agency and structure are intertwined, and they are always acting together, acting and interacting. So that the point is how, the big question is actually how do structures emerge out of the multi-sided and multi-authored practices that form a certain historical process.
Perfect. Since we have talked about the spatial scales, and now I ask you how to work with the multiple temporalities of global history, and if, in your opinion, is there a short-term global history?
Yeah, I think that this is another important question, and it follows somehow from my reply anyway. My answer can follow from my previous thoughts, in the sense that when people think about scales, they also think about multiple temporal scales. So that certain phenomenon, certain historical practices and processes would be located in a short-term scale, like those more involving more agency, and while structures would be at the higher or long-term temporal scales. I mean, we all have, I think, in mind Brodel with its tripartition of time, the slow time of and long-term time of the structures, and then moving into the evenementialité, and therefore the short-term agitated reality of where agency is the king or the queen. But this is a kind of, again, a kind of understanding of history and of the historical fabric in this sense, in terms of temporalities, that is very much present in the history manifesto of Gouldy and Armitage. You find that, but even in Conrad, you find that, which is to me quite surprising, because I really love the way he addresses the question of global history. But still, even there, you see this divide between the short term and the long term, and the idea that somehow microhistory is confined to the short term and global history can finally get us to the long term. I think, again, this is not the way I see things. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is how it is. I see that we have to go beyond, once again, this divide of short term, long term, and the way to do this is, again, to get rid of this scalar idea of temporalities and really think in terms of the coexistence and the entanglement among different multiple temporalities within the same context, because temporalities is perceived and experienced in a different way by class, by gender, by ethnicity, and it's perceived and experiences differently across different contexts in relation to different historical processes, etc. So this brings me to two very important points as far as I understand them. One is the two radical point, if you want. One is the need to think again, to rethink radically about periodization. It is somehow curious or surreal, if you like, that global history, which wants to overcome ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, methodological nationalism, still uses the standard categories of periodization. We still talk about ancient, medieval, early modern, and modern history. We still think about certain big divides like the 19th century, the 16th century, as if this broader understanding that comes with the rejection of Eurocentrism hasn't get us far enough as to problematize radically this periodization. I think we have to go towards adopt periodization that are constructed in the process of research. So just like you cannot predefine the spatial unit, we also have to be aware and not to and avoid to predefine the temporal units of our research. If I do a research about slavery, it is important not to start with the predefinition of what the temporality there is, but to really look into the primary sources, reflect on them, read from other sources, secondary sources, eventually beyond our own disciplines, take from information from sociology, anthropology, geography, and then go back to the primary sources and rethink this periodization. And the second point is connected to this, and it is the huge question of finally moving beyond the concept of modernity itself. So I'm not arguing for a concept of plural modernities, but I'm arguing for unthinking modernity, as Gennaro Ascione wrote in a very, very good book. Unthinking modernity means that we are free from this idea of a teleological history, free from this idea of a linear history that somehow, even if we see the differences across different contexts, somehow there is a sort of teleology in history. There is no teleology. And the reason why there is no teleology is because the fabric of history is built precisely by those multiple and multi-authored practices that concur simultaneously but conflicting in structuring broader generative models and broader social processes. And because of this, there is no predefined linearity, there is no predefined direction in history, and we really have to look at the sources, to look at the material we have in order to understand what were the sets and the conflicting sets of context, of processes that made this transformation. So basically, when there is a shift, a change in history, we have to locate that. We have to understand why this change comes and why this change comes in that specific way, rather than selecting those changes that somehow obey our predefined idea of a shift to modernity, a shift to this kind of predefined periodization that we have in mind very strongly, and which we have some time to learn unthinking.
Perfect. And Dr. De Vito, does each type of research object have, in your opinion, the potential to become a global history?
So there we go, of course, again, about the question of what we think about global history. Of course, if we think about global history, and this is not my take, in terms of like being a certain spatial units when we do history, then of course, I mean, that kind of global history is very much like the history of globalization or of processes that we think are at this global scale. But in my take, in my microspatial take, I think that just to reframe your question from my own perspective, does each type of research object have the potential to become microspatial? Yes, then I think it is, precisely because we do not predefine the spatial unit, the categorization, and the temporal units. Yeah, then, well, yes, we can have a look at what happens in those processes, and therefore any kind of historical processes can be approached in that way. It's not that I am particularly arrogant. I hope I don't come like that in this video anyway. I just think that there is a potential there to really study any kind of historical process in human history with this kind of perspective. And this is a sort of liberating thing that I think it's implicit in the microspatial. The reason really is that this is the potential that comes from the fact that we pose a certain research question, and we can pose that to different kind of contexts, but we can even compare this context by means of this research question, but knowing that the answers will differ because the different contexts are, whether chronologically, whether diachronically or synchronically, they are different. So we pose some broad questions, but we allow the historical context to tell us its own answer. So if we pose the question of why, for example, the elites or the ruling classes were trying to limit the mobility of the subaltern groups, this is a broad question. We can pose that to many different historical contexts, but then by the microspatial approach, we have the possibility of really looking at how in each specific context this limitation of mobility and eventually these processes of immobilization that go together with mobilization or forced mobilization even, how they were actually happening, how they were actually taking place. So once again, with the example of Atlantic slavery, we ask how this was done, but then we can really look at how in each context, even within the Atlantic world, how people were mobilized, they were forced to move from one part, from Africa to the Americas, but at the same time, we allow us to look at the specific dynamics, at the specific processes that are there, at the specific spatiality and at the specific temporalities that emerge from this analysis.
Perfect. And our last question, not least, what are the main risks and challenges in global history, in your opinion?
Yeah, I might repeat myself, but I really think that the biggest risk is to assume that the global in global history is a predefined spatial unit. It's something that it's already there, and it's not a construction, a difficult construction made of the tensions that are there socially and among different territories. Global history, if we want to use this label, is really a mindset, and the way I develop this mindset is this microspatial approach. But let me say one last thing, that these questions that we are posing here, this epistemological question, although the word again is not very sexy, but it's very important, they are not like a sort of academic game only. The way we conceptualize and we understand the fabric of history, that is the fabric of the past of human societies, it is really relevant in order to understand the fabric of the future and the present of human societies. So this microspatial approach, or this global historical mindset, if you like, is really something that trains us to think about the processes that are there in our world and that will be there in the future, in order to understand how things actually develop. So just to make an example, if we take a macro historical approach, we would have then a certain understanding of the process of globalization now as something that is already up there at this level where structure is posited and with very little possibility from our own agency, even collective agency, to change this. But if we take a micro-spatial approach, if we take this perspective, we can see that globalization is very much a project or a set of projects of the elite, of conflicting projects, conflicting globalizations, and that there is only a whole host of different globalization that are alternative to the top-down globalization that the media tell us every day. And all this way of reasoning, all these mindsets allow us to liberate ourselves from a lot of stereotypes that are there in the public discourse. Think about the question of migration. If we really take it seriously, that mobility has been the standard and migration has been the standard in human history, then the problem is not just like looking at the last flow of migration that we are experiencing now, but really to rethink the humanity as a métissage, as a melting pot from the very beginning. This gives a completely different mindset, a completely different approach to political issues, and not just to academic and historical or historiographic issue. So what I'm really arguing here is that what is at stake when we talk about global history, when we talk about the possibility of having global history connecting to microhistory, when we talk about epistemology, so the theory of history, the way we see history, this is very much a political issue as much as an academic and scholarly issue. And exactly for this reason, I am so passionate about talking about these issues, because what is at stake is not just our small discussion among historians, but it is really the possibility of understanding our present society and the future of human society in what we are doing, the capacity of all of us to really have agency and impact on social processes, of really not locating in our mind that certain things are so much up there that there is nothing we can do about that. There is a possibility to alter those processes precisely for the same reason why in the past we can see that those processes that we call globalization, that we call colonization, empire, wars, have been affected not only by the central authorities, but by a host of other actors, collectively and individually. This is a liberating perspective, I think, and it gives also the social role of historians a different perspective, because then we can really look for collaborative research, which is not the kind of collaborative research of those collective projects where people are working on a database, but a real exchange of knowledge, a real exchange of experience and skill, even linguistic skill. It is a sort of radical understanding of collaboration across cultures and across languages. Now we are speaking in English, as we do in many kind of global history projects, but in fact, if we are really serious about collaboration and about this kind of microspatial history, we can invent our research also linguistically in a way that where a lot of multiple directions of linguistic exchange are there, and therefore all the cultural backgrounds, the academic backgrounds, the historiographic backgrounds that each of us brings with him or with herself can actually come to the fore. So these are my thoughts on your very interesting questions. I hope the message somehow is clear. And again, I try to make it clear and eventually a little bit critic, or maybe very much critical, precisely because I think that being clear on this, on positioning ourselves in this huge and confusing and conflicting field that has become global history is important in order not to have this ecumenical global history where everybody is part of, without clear-cut understanding of what divides this field and what has to divide this field because of what is at stake in the different understanding of global history or microhistory of history, in fact, as such.
Thank you so much for your very inspiring answers and for taking your time to talk to us. It was a really great pleasure to hear from you, and I hope to see you in Brazil someday.
That would be great. Thank you very much.